We have today an extraordinarily distinguished roundtable of former attorneys general. I want to focus our attention on the issue of incarceration rates in the United States. And just to set the stage a bit, I mentioned this when we were chatting just briefly before, all of you turn out to have been attorneys general during the beginning and the culmination of this trend. From 1920 to 1973, incarceration rates in the United States were approximately 100 per 100,000. In 1925, we had 119 per 100,000. In 1939, we hit a high water mark of 200 per 100,000. And then in 1974, things began to change very dramatically. And all of you served as attorneys general after 1974. In 2006, we went from our more historic 100 out of 100,000 to 750 per 100,000. And by 2008, if you added in not just the prisons but the jails, we reached approximately 1 in 100 behind bars. If you add to that not only the people behind bars, but those who remain on some form of specific control, like parole or probation, there's approximately 2 for every 1, so that we now have, when you combine the prison population with probation, parole, you're at approximately 7.2 million people in the United States, which is roughly the size of the combined cities of Chicago and Los Angeles. So we're at rates that we have not seen ever before. And we have I must say it was a little bit of a surprise to me to hear, but Pat Robertson on his show gave some remarks about this. So we're going to hear just a few moments from Pat Robertson.
5% of the world's population, but we make up 25% of jailed prisoners. Even though these prisoners may have been sentenced by some court for some offense, should they be behind bars? Here's the thing. We have now over 3,000, the number must be much higher than that, but over 3,000 federal crimes. And every time the liberals pass a bill, I don't care what it involves, they stick criminal sanctions on it. They don't feel that there's any way that people are going to keep a law unless they can put them in jail. And so we have the jails filled with people who are white-collar criminals. And I became sort of a hero of the hippie culture, I guess, when I said I think we ought to decriminalize the possession of marijuana. I just think it's shocking how many of these young people wind up in prison and they get turned into hardcore criminals because they have had possession of a very small amount of a controlled substance. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. And we've said, well, we're conservatives, we're tough on crime. That's baloney. It's costing us billions and billions of dollars. Now think of California. California's spending more money on prisons than it spends on schools. I mean, there's something wrong about that equation, you know? There's something wrong. And I think we need to scrub the federal code and the state codes and take away these criminal penalties. There's restitution, there are all kinds of fines, there are things you can do, but putting people in jail at a huge expense to the population is insanity.
So I know, Attorney General Thornburgh, you've spoken about this in Pennsylvania more recently, and I'm interested in your reflections. I mean, let me begin with a little bit of a confession. You know, this happened in my professional lifetime, right? I graduated from law school in 1977, and I must admit, until relatively recently when I started paying attention to this, I had no idea that our incarceration rates had taken off like this. It just sort of happened during my lifetime. It seemed normal. There had been some fussing about the sentencing guidelines, but until I started looking at these numbers, it just sort of crept up on me. And I'm wondering, I mean, now we have budget pressures principally driving a lot of this. Where are we at with this? And from the Attorney General, I'm not talking about just federal crimes here. The Attorney General takes a look at the justice system more broadly. Attorney General Thornburgh, what do we do with this?
You got 2 problems, basically. One is a misallocation of resources, building more prisons, sentencing people to longer terms, and not recognizing that it's the certainty of punishment rather than the length of punishment that theoretically has the opportunity to act as a deterrent. And that can be accomplished by diverting some of those resources going into prison into better and smarter policing, as has been done in some of our major metropolitan areas. The second area is the over-criminalization problem, to which you and Reverend Robertson referred to. We have no federal criminal code. It's just a stack of laws that have been passed over the years, and the last time an effort was made to sort them out, it failed because it couldn't develop a head of steam in the Congress. The Congress, sooner or later, is going to have to deal with the problem of over-criminalization, not only in terms of minor offenses, but in terms of, there are over 50 or 60 different definitions of mental state that are utilized in assessing criminal culpability. It's fraught with all kinds of conflict, and it's become a pet hot-button issue with me, and I'll be speaking about it tomorrow night, for example, to just scrub, as you put it, the entire federal criminal code. A lot of our state codes are in better shape because they drew off the model penal code of the American Law Institute, but at the federal level, it is an absolute mess. You really want to know what I know? Want to know? You want to know what I want to say?
The problem really is a state problem, not a federal problem. The number of prisoners, I think, in the federal system is about 200,000. So 1,800,000 are state prisoners. And so the Attorney General can relate to that or affect that by use of the bully pulpit. And my view and arguments as Attorney General was always that we're putting the wrong people in jail. We ought to put the people who cause the greatest harm to the greatest number of people. They ought to be in jail because not only was the harm great, but the risk of further harm was great. And therefore, we ought to have fewer prisoners for longer terms. The cost of a prisoner in most state systems is somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year per prisoner to put them in prison. But unfortunately, the problem is not just the prioritization of prosecutions. And we developed a white-collar crime list and paper on prioritization, the most harm to the most people, and the most likelihood of it continuing if they were not incarcerated. But that isn't enough, because we now have the terrible problem of drugs, and tiny amounts of drugs in possession and in addition in use are grounds for long-term sentences, because long-term sentences associated with drugs were politically sound. That is, the public, unfortunately, said, you know, if you're a druggie, put them away and forget about them. And drugs cause such harm to society that that attitude is very hard to dispel. But employment, skills, trades, so that some of these young people who are between the ages of 15 and 30 can be employed, can have a livelihood, can have a future, needs to be done, and done much more bolder than we do now. I don't have the knowledge of how work programs can be developed in states and the cost of those programs, or how they can be assisted by the federal government in some type of WPA program or something akin to it. But it's not simply an investigation and prosecution matter. It's a society matter.
Let me ask you, well, we do have some states that have been making some interesting progress on this and have reduced their prison populations dramatically, and so there are some models out there for ways to start working on it. But I want to ask you how we have a more extended conversation about this at a national level when we involve more sensitive questions involving race in particular, because let me give you some more statistics on this, because I think it really becomes a topic that is difficult for us to address at a national level, and it's impossible for us to ignore. If you look at a Latino, a male Latino, born 1945 to 1949, so that generation, that person had a lifetime chance. This doesn't mean that that percentage is in there right now, but over that person's lifetime, there was a 2.8% chance that man would spend at least 1 year in prison. For the next generation, born between 1975 and 1979, the number goes to 12.2%. This is a dramatic increase on percentage basis between the generations. Now let's look at African Americans. For the African American male born between 1945 to 1949, the lifetime chance of spending 1 year in prison was 10.4%. 1 in 10, pretty shocking. For the next generation born between 1975 and 1979, the rate is 26.8%, greater than 1 in 4 chance. And if we sort by one more demographic, we take the African American male born between 1975 and 1979, and we now say, let's look at those that are high school dropouts. The lifetime chance of incarceration is 68%. So we have here a demographic that indicates that the skyrocketing incarceration rates are a national problem, but they aren't a national problem shared equally by ethnicity and race. And so how do we go about having a national conversation about that so that we have the tools to begin to address it?
Well, for one thing, there is a role for the federal government to play in cases of invidious discrimination in law enforcement. And I'm always hark back to our experience in the Rodney King case, where the beating of a motorist occurred and the state trial resulted in an acquittal of the police officers involved, followed quickly by federal prosecution, which resulted in conviction. And that's standard operating procedure within the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to ensure that aberrations that occur at the local level are addressed through the enforcement of our civil rights laws. So that's a leadership role to deal with invidious discrimination. What you're talking about, however, it seems to me, is a much more sophisticated kind of effect that results from inadequate schooling, inadequate health care, inadequate community services, the whole range of things that may not be available in African American and Latino communities to the extent they are in other communities within the country. Those are political problems that have to be addressed and have to be taken up by our political leaders and, frankly, addressed in constructive ways, which very seldom do we see, I'm sorry to say.
This is, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think in a way that when you're talking to 4 ex-attorneys general, you're talking to some of the wrong people about a lot of the phenomena that you're talking about here, because that has to do with access to services, it has to do with access to education, it has to do with access to opportunity, which is outside, except in gross cases, the reach of the law. What used to concern me when I was Attorney General, and still does, is not simply rates or length of incarceration, but what we do with people in jail once they get there, and what the recidivism rates are coming out. You know, all the television programs end with the defendant being carted off to jail. Nobody concerns themselves with what happens afterwards. And I will tell you, what happens afterwards is often ghastly. The prison population is getting younger and meaner, and the resources are getting smaller, and there is only, certainly on the federal level, and there's only so long that society can continue to allocate lower and lower resources to a prison population, because there really isn't any political support for developing programs and sophisticated evaluation systems within prisons. But that really is the time bomb.
I was just gonna, the numbers that you just cited are shocking, but most people don't know about it. And so they can ignore it. Even our political leaders choose not to become informed about this kind of problem. But I think that Mike is right in terms of, in terms of what the Attorney General can do is fairly limited, other than talk about this issue, obviously. But you're talking about situations where there is poor educational opportunities. You're talking about children growing up today where they're in households with no fathers. And so you're talking about systemic, major societal problems here that cannot be solved by the Office of the Attorney General. It's going to require the combined efforts of not just our political leadership, but our community leadership, our schools, organizations at the local level.
Isn't part of our issue, though, we've always had social problems. It's not like in the 1930s we were in times of plenty and the communities had rich social services available to take care of their children and all of their problems. It seems that one of our biggest differences really is, starting in 1974 and going forward, we've approached our social problems much more often with the criminal justice system. And there's a book by a guy named Drucker who actually says he's an epidemiologist by trade. And so he says that if you were looking for the poisoned well in London that started all of the problems they had as an epidemiologist, how would you do it? And he goes back and he says it's the Nelson Rockefeller drug laws in New York. That's the start. They got tough with drug laws in New York. That got exported out. Now, I don't know whether he's right or he's wrong about that. But the issue here, it seems to me, is not that we have just social problems, because we surely do, but that we have chosen since the mid-1970s to address those social problems through the criminal justice system. And we've convened groups with the department, the supervisors and directors of departments of corrections across the country. And they will tell you that they have become the dumping ground for every social problem there is, and in most states, if not all of them, the single largest provider of mental health services in the state is the prison and jail system. So how did we get there, and more importantly, how do we get ourselves out of that mindset? I mean, it seems to me this is now cutting across political spectrums. I chose Pat Robertson's clip. Senator Webb has been arguing for a commission for some time. There's prison projects from the ACLU. I don't think anyone would be as surprised to hear those voices in favor of these things. But you've got Pat Robertson, you've got a number of very significant conservative voices out there addressing this topic. But how do we come up with different solutions? I understand, as Attorney General Civiletti says, the federal prison population is just over 200,000. That's not where the big numbers are. But we still see at federal levels the same kinds of approaches. How do we fix that?
I used to preface my remarks to groups when I was in office dealing with the drug problem by saying, if you want to lose the war on drugs, just leave it to law enforcement. And that wasn't meant to denigrate the efforts of the Drug Enforcement Administration or our prosecutors or what have you. What it was meant to do was to focus the attention on what the real causes of the drug problem were. And those are, as we have enumerated once again here today, society's failings and our failing to take the initiative in programs that are designed to prevent, to treat, to rehabilitate, to educate people about the dangers of drug use, and we simply don't do a good job of that. We never have. And the default responsibility then comes to the law enforcement community, which has not done a good job and never can on its own.